Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from the heart of Mississippi is my friend Jim Woodrick. Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So Jim has been kind enough to invite me to come to Mississippi later in August, and he's going to show me the sights. And so as I've been prepping, one of the first things I looked at was his book, The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi. And Jim, this book came out in 2016. So some of our
hard to believe.
It might be a little old, but a fantastic read. I love this book. So
Thank you.
Want to bring
Thank
out
you so much.
Yeah. So first, for our viewers and our listeners, you're in Jackson, Mississippi. So this history lives around you all the time, but a lot of that history is gone, over the last 160 years. What happened to it?
Well, like a lot of other urban battlefields, I probably compare it to Atlanta, although Jackson's not Atlanta. But unfortunately, most of the sites have been paved over long ago. It just, for a lot of reasons that I touched on in my book, the siege of Jackson was sort of an oversight, even during the war. The siege of Vicksburg had just ended on July 4. The repercussions from the Battle of Gettysburg had taken place, and the siege sort of ended in a whimper instead of a grand charge or even the capitulation of an army. Johnston simply crossed the Pearl River and left in the middle of the night. So it never got the press, if you will, during the war. And I think it was just forgotten. And as Jackson really began growing in the late 19th century and early 20th century, those places were just lost to memory.
You mentioned that the siege ends kind of in a whimper, and Joe Johnston slips away, and we'll get to that in a second. But William T. Sherman is his antagonist there, and Sherman's like, okay, we'll let him go. It's really hot. We don't have water. We'll just let him go. I mean, that was kind of
well, not quite. We'll get into that, but not quite. But one of the interesting aspects I think about the siege is that this was Sherman's second chance at independent command. And the first one, of course, didn't end very well. That was Chickasaw Bayou. So here we are 7 months later. Grant kind of rolls the dice on Sherman again. They've gotten to they're sort of in sync after the siege of Vicksburg. He entrusts Sherman with the command of the outer lines at Vicksburg, the lines facing Johnston's army. And then he sends him on this expedition with this temporary expeditionary force. And Sherman performs well enough, but I don't think it was anything to write home about, to be honest. And of course, we all know what happens in less than a year. It's Sherman and Johnston again in the Atlanta campaign. So it's got a lot of echoes for later on in the war.
And this was an assignment that Sherman didn't particularly want, but just because of where he was positioned on the siege lines, he got it kind of by default, right?
I think he would have much rather have been there to enjoy the fruits of his labors. Really, Sherman's Corps took the brunt of the fighting on May 19 and May 22nd in Vicksburg. And I'm sure he would have enjoyed participating in the celebration after Vicksburg fell, but there was more work to do. And Grant relied on Sherman for this. Sherman was, as you indicated, already assigned in some way to the rear lines of Grant's army, watching the Big Black for Joe Johnston, who never came. We can get into that too, but yeah, I think Sherman would have rather been anywhere other than Jackson. And it was a miserably hot part of the summer too. It was just brutal, kind of like it is now.
You say Sherman would have preferred to be anywhere else. And I get the sense that Joe Johnston would have preferred to be anywhere else too.
There's no doubt about it. When Johnston was sent to Mississippi in early May, he arrived in Jackson on May 13, as you know, just the day before the Battle of Jackson. He immediately wired folks in Richmond and said, I am too late to save Vicksburg. He hadn't even looked to see what the defenses were around the city of Jackson yet. He didn't know exactly what troops he had, but he'd already decided that it was too late to save Vicksburg. And frankly, he may have been right, but he didn't even give it the good old college try. But over the next few weeks, Johnston received increasingly large number of reinforcements from both the Army of Tennessee, from the Confederate East Coast, from South Carolina primarily, from Mobile, and by the middle of June, he had approximately 30,000 men on hand, which is not an inconsequential number of troops, including a division of cavalry under William H. Red Jackson. And they were veterans. And he might have been able to do something, but Johnston just never believed in the mission. He firmly believed that once Pemberton was holed up in Vicksburg, that the cause was lost, and it would have been better to have saved the army. I can't think you really can argue with Johnston in the long run, but.
And even, he had enough troops even there in May that by the time Grant gets to the outskirts of Vicksburg, like Johnston's enough of a threat that Grant launches those first attacks against the city on the 19th and the 22nd of May, because he's afraid that if he waits too long, Johnston might do something. It's sort of like this specter that hangs over his shoulders, isn't it?
It's a specter, but really in the first weeks of May, it's only a shadow. He really hasn't gotten the strength that he needs yet. I'm talking about Johnston. Mm-hmm. When he finally does get all the components of what would be an army that could actually do something, by that time, Grant has received more reinforcements than Pemberton and Johnston combined, and had completed the circumvallation of the Vicksburg siege lines to the south. So by that time, it was too late, I think. But Johnston, again, never tried. That's the thing. He never tried.
So why do you think that is?
Well, as I said, I just don't think he believed in the mission.
Okay.
And there's another component here. He and Davis just did not get along. That stems way back to the beginning of the war, when Johnston felt that he was rightly owed the top spot in the Confederate rankings, and the generals by rank, and he didn't get it. And Samuel Cooper got it instead. But Johnston never forgave Davis, and they were just at each other's throats the entire time. As you know, the Western Theater typically got the dregs of the Confederate command anyway. Yeah. And for whatever reason, the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana got the dregs of the dregs. So, we got William W. Loring after all. So need I say more?
And Johnston's always struck me as that guy who has this incredible reputation that everybody buys into, and he doesn't really want to do anything to ruin his reputation. And
I think you're right. And I think his biggest admirers, if you want to put it that way, let's say the people who respected him the most probably during this campaign was Grant and Sherman. His fellow Confederates didn't necessarily. But yeah, Grant and Sherman, I think it had to do with his West Point training. And he was cautious. Johnston was always very careful, kind of reminds me of McClellan in a way. And when somebody's both cautious and has a good eye for defense, it makes for a bloody campaign. And I think that's one thing that Grant was concerned about. He knew that Johnston was smart. He wasn't going to do anything that was foolhardy. In fact, he didn't do anything during the campaign. So,
So the city falls, Vicksburg that is, and by that point, Johnson is finally sort of crept up close to the Big Black, and then Sherman has to turn around and chase him off. Set the stage for me there a little bit. And, you mentioned that Sherman doesn't really want this task, but he has to have it. And so what does he do?
Yeah, there was what's called a Mechanicsburg corridor I'm sorry, north of Vicksburg, between the Big Black and the Yazoo River. And this is where Grant thought that Johnston would come. It was kind of an open area coming down from Yazoo City and Canton. And if Johnston could have crossed the Big Black River, which he could have at some point, they might have made trouble for Grant. So Grant early on began reinforcing really with troops that he couldn't spare during the Vicksburg siege for a while to face north and east toward the Big Black River, to guard all the river crossings, including the most vital one on the Jackson Road near where the Battle of the Big Black River took place on May 17. But Johnston never really pushed it, but he did start moving finally. He had enough cables, I guess you could say, from Richmond finally that he decided to do something. I personally think that Johnston thought he should do something just so it would look like he had done something. He very well knew that Vicksburg was just about to fall. So he starts moving about July 1. And that's far too late, as we know. He got to the Big Black, some of the crossings, and that's when they learned that Vicksburg had fallen, and Sherman had already been assigned by Grant. Grant planned ahead with everything. He said, as soon as Vicksburg falls, you go after Johnston. And Johnston immediately beats a retreat toward Jackson. Incredibly, the earthworks at Jackson all this time had still not been really prepared for defense. They were not in good shape. So you have to question why Johnston hadn't even done that. But by the time Sherman's expeditionary force marches to Jackson, which is about 35, 40 miles from Vicksburg, takes them several days because of the heat and because Johnston has some pretty pesky cavalry out in front to stall the Union advance, makes them deploy and all of that, your standard operating procedure for Civil War armies. By the time Sherman arrives in front of Jackson on July 9, the earthworks around Jackson are in pretty good order. Johnston's been using not only slave labor, but some of his own troops and some of the civilians even to shore up the works. I may be getting ahead of myself, but when Sherman arrives in front of Jackson, he's not sure if Johnston's still there or not, because Johnston has that reputation already of hightailing it. But he finds out quickly that they're not only there, but they're behind prepared earthworks. And one would think that he might test it, Sherman that is, and launch an assault, but he doesn't do that. And I think it's obvious why he didn't. Sherman's corps was the one, as I said previously, that assaulted Vicksburg on May 19 and again on May 22nd with the rest of the army and took a bloodletting. And I don't think Sherman had any appetite at that point to assault prepared earthworks again. You can kind of look at that in the Atlanta campaign, the same light. He doesn't ever confront Johnston straight on. He flanks him. But there was no flanking Jackson because Johnston had his earthworks anchored on the north and the south on the Pearl River. So they were pretty stout earthworks.
City's pretty well enclosed, pretty well defended, and
yeah.
Sherman, of course, knows that Johnston's an engineer, so he's up against someone who knows what he's doing there. One of the things that I thought was really interesting when you wrote about in your book about as Johnston's making that movement toward Jackson, his men really do a lot to spoil whatever water sources are along the way. And you've mentioned a couple times already, like how miserably hot it was. So that becomes a pretty intense logistical problem for Sherman, doesn't it?
Well, not only for Sherman, but for Johnston. It's terribly hot. It's hard on all the soldiers. And yes, you're right. The Johnston detailed some of his troops to drive cattle into some of the ponds that still had water in them, and shoot them and leave them there to sort of ruin the water for the Federals coming along behind them. The cisterns the same way. Grant had done something similar in Vicksburg by trying to poison, if you will, the Mississippi River so that Confederates couldn't draw water from the Mississippi. So it's nothing particularly unusual, but as hot and dry as it was in central Mississippi in July 1863, it was really tough on the Union soldiers. And I got to mention one type of soldier, if you will, in particular. Those were the men of the Ninth Corps.
I was going to ask you about them, because here they're making a kind of a cameo appearance in Vicksburg after being.
Yeah, they arrived in mid-June from Kentucky. They had been part of Burnside's troops, and I think they had been posted in South Carolina maybe earlier in the war. I'm not sure. I have to be honest. I need to check that, but they had been in Kentucky for a while, and Kentucky is no Mississippi in the summer. And here they get shipped down on transports and arrive at Vicksburg, which is pretty much hell for any troops. It's hot. There are a lot of mosquitoes. There are, alligators around and all sorts of curious things. And the Ninth Corps under John G. Parke, which hails from, which makes it even worse, mostly from the eastern seaboard states. These are guys from New Hampshire, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. They're not used to this, and they, being from the Eastern Army, also get ribbed a lot by the guys in Grant's mostly Western Army. There's always that competition between Eastern and Western troops in both armies. So they really have a rough time. But the Ninth Corps guys marched as well as the other troops in Sherman's Expeditionary Force, and they weathered the storm, so to speak. So I think it's ironic, and I know I'm going to the end of the siege here, but I think it's ironic that when Johnston evacuated in the middle of the night, it was the Ninth Corps troops who occupied the city before any of Sherman's men. That made the Western guys mad. They really did.
But there, as I recall, there's a certain grudging acceptance of those Ninth Corps guys by the end of the season. They do hold up, as well as everybody else. So Sherman shows up at the edge of the city. Johnston's hunkered down inside. There's not the obvious assault. So Sherman begins this artillery bombardment, but he soon realizes he probably doesn't have the artillery to do that. And
what he doesn't have is heavy artillery ammunition. He first of all moves his troops out to max the Confederate works. He spreads them out as you would. He's got his own 15th Corps, commanded down by Frederick Steele, on his far right, extending to the southern end of the Confederate line is the 13th Corps. That's the largest in this expedition under EOC Ord, and Parke's 9th Corps is sent on the northern end of the left, Union left end of the line. And then there's more than a division of the 16th Corps present. So Sherman has a fairly substantial army here. About half of all the troops that were at Vicksburg, but it's one that will never exist again. It's just a sort of a hodgepodge army. But once those guys spread out, they start testing the works, send out patrols, send out skirmishers, set up. I mean, they've been doing this already at Vicksburg, some of them at least. And so they know how to lay siege. They've become their own engineers in some ways and start digging some rudimentary earthworks. There are no siege lines on the Union side at Jackson per se, other than gun emplacements. But back to your point, yes, he begins a bombardment of the city, but it's not heavy because he doesn't have a lot of artillery ammunition, and it's fairly light. We're talking about Parrott rifles and things. He really needs some siege type guns, 32 pounders and all. Johnston, by the way, has some of those in his lines, a couple of 32-pound rifle cannon and several heavy batteries spread around. So it's a good line. By the way, both sides are about equal in numbers here. So that's another good reason why Sherman wouldn't assault. As you know, the thinking of the day was that you needed about a 2-to-1 advantage to be able to assault. At least that was in theory.
So what's Johnston's end game then here? He's got himself backed up into the city. He's hunkered down. Is he just thinking that Sherman's going to get up and go away? You know, I mean, like, what's he to accomplish?
That's one thing that has escaped me.
Okay.
It's hard to get into Johnston's mind. You know, he did nothing for May and June other than collect troops and complain that he didn't have enough troops at the same time. And yet when he backs up into Jackson, he takes on this almost a martyr figure. He gives this great speech to his troops by circular. And it's like, who is this guy? If he had been doing this all along, I think he was truly committed to defending the capital city of Jackson, at least for the time being. Possibly he thought Sherman might give up and go back, but he should have known better. But Johnston had an out, and that is that unlike the Mississippi, the Pearl River could easily be crossed, and so he had an easy escape hatch. And what changed his mind was that he learned that Sherman had heavy artillery ammunition en route from Vicksburg, even tried to intercept it with some Confederate cavalry out in the open there, and they failed. And that's when Johnston decided that it was time to go.
And he decides to send Jackson's cavalry, Red Jackson, as opposed to the city of
Yes,
Jackson,
right,
up and around it to try to interfere with that ammunition train. And then like one of these crazy little coincidences shows up where someone walks into a federal headquarters and says, "Hey, I've got some news for you." And I thought that was, one of those weird little instances of war. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't remember all.
No, that's fine. It was a fellow named Leroy Carter, who apparently served in an Iowa regiment, and possibly was captured. It's kind of a mystery. But then he apparently either made himself out to be a Confederate or convinced the Confederates that he was some kind of sympathetic Union character. And then when the time was right, he slipped out of the ranks of the Confederate side and went and told Sherman what was going on with the cavalry. It's the strangest thing. I just ran up on it, and I don't know that I'll ever know the truth of it. And I appreciate you picking up on that recently in the emerging Civil War thing. But
that's a great story. The detective work you must have done to find that. It was pretty
well,
cool.
The thing I couldn't figure out is really who he was. I mean, that's it's a mystery. I guess we'll never know. But there were a lot of spies used during the Vicksburg campaign. We know that Stephen Hurlbut had quite a number of spies operating in the countryside, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had been in and out of both armies for quite a while. But it could be a complete coincidence. So who knows?
So he tips the Federals off, and that's what foils the cavalry raid, and Sherman's able to get his artillery. There is some at times pretty heavy infantry engagement that happens after Sherman first gets there. How significant was that as far as you think dissuading Johnston from sticking around?
I don't know that had anything particularly to dissuade Johnston from staying. In fact, I think it probably encouraged him, if anything. And one thing you're referring to there is on the northern end of the city, the Union left flank, Park's Corps was engaged in several fairly strong skirmishes. I guess we would call them a reconnaissance in force. They were never really pushed. But on the other end of the line, the southern end of the city, on July 12th, there was a very unfortunate attack by Isaac Pugh's brigade of Lauman's division of the 13th Corps. Isaac Pugh was an old man. In other words, he was my age. He really was an old man by that time, and he had been around a while, and he could see that the place that he had been ordered into was a trap, if you will, opposite this cornfield where he had been ordered to advance by his division commander, Jacob Lauman. He could see the entire division under John C. Brackenridge, which included the famous Orphan Brigade. Of course, they would fight heavily at Chickamauga in just a couple of months later. And Brackenridge was a good officer. These were Johnston's best troops at Jackson. And to make a long story short, Isaac Pugh's brigade of some almost 900 men lost more than 50% casualties in this very unfortunate attack on July 12th in about an hour. Wow. So just a slaughter. And as a result, Jacob Lauman was dismissed from the service, sent home to Iowa, and never again participated in the war. Sherman had nothing to do with this episode. Ord probably didn't either, but he did take care of Lauman. But the effect was that all these men were laying on the field in this hot sun, and the wounded and the dead. And unfortunately, Sherman did what Grant did at Vicksburg. He made no effort to collect the wounded for a couple of days. And finally, Breckinridge's men asked Johnston to request a truce to bury the dead. And Sherman, in this case, accepted that, but asked that his men bury their own dead and retrieve the wounded. And the Confederates honestly said, it's too late for that. They're too gone. And they used long hooks that were used to move cotton bales to pull the bodies into ditches and buried them there on the battlefield. They were too far gone. So, Sherman is a mystery, an enigma. He could be very kind at times. He could be brutal at times. This is one of his brutal times. It was written about by many men, what happened to Pugh's brigade. At the same time, during that truce, you see one of those wonderful examples that you saw at Vicksburg, you see at Petersburg, several times during the war, where men met between the lines and exchanged stories, tobacco, coffee. Some of them just wanted to see what people from another part of the country looked like. Those are heartwarming stories.
No, nobody had horns, as I recall.
Right, nobody. Except those from New York. You know, we all know that. Yeah, they do.
I want to go back to Brackenridge for just a second, because he's one of those guys that, to me, I mean, he is the Confederacy's utility infielder who just shows up everywhere in the war.
Good way to put it. Yeah,
quite a record. How do you think he performs overall during the campaign?
I think he does a great job, and I think he's probably, although the Kentuckians were not happy about coming to Mississippi because they were getting farther and farther away from Kentucky. They were very glad to get away from Braxton Bragg, and especially Brackenridge. So I think he did a very good job in the Jackson campaign. Of course, there wasn't a lot to do once you're in a siege line. I mean, his works were strong. He had veteran troops. He had one of the best artillery units in the Confederate Army on his line. One of the companies of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans. As I said, the Orphan Brigade. So he was in a good position. It was actually Brackenridge who had the responsibility for holding Jackson during that interim period when Johnston's so-called Army of Relief was gathering north and northwest of Jackson. Brackenridge was placed in charge of Jackson for that period. So I guess you could say, in one way, Brackenridge could have done something to strengthen the works during that period, but if Johnston didn't order him to, I don't guess I can fault him for that. Sure. But even during you mentioned the sort of the being a choice hitter or something there. I'm not a baseball fan, so don't. But even during the siege, some of his troops were used as shock troops, if you will, on the extreme right of the line. William W. Loring's division came under some pretty intense combat from the Ninth Corps troops on that end of the line. And I don't know that they were in any real danger, but Loring doesn't have a great reputation, and Loring's division is the one that got lost, if you will. That's one interpretation at Champion Hill, and they arrived in Jackson without any accoutrements. There were no arms. They were just a division with just wandering around. So they basically had to be refitted. I don't think Johnston put much stock in Loring, which was very wise. And so when Loring's troops were being pushed on that end of the line, who does he send? The Orphan Brigade, all the way from the southern end of the line to support the other part. Now, that's not saying a lot for Jackson. I haven't mentioned the city itself. In 1860, it consisted of about 5,000 people. It was not the largest city in Mississippi, but of course, its significance was that it's the capital. It's symbolic for that reason, but the real military significance of Jackson are the railroads. This is one of 4 cities in Jackson where the railroads crossed. The other 2, Meridian, Corinth, we know what importance Corinth was. And I guess if Johnston had a particular reason for staying, it could have been to hold the railroad open as long as he could, but he must have known that it was a losing effort.
At some point, he just decides, okay, it's time for me to leave.
And that point was when he knew that Sherman had the heavy artillery ammunition, and he was about to open up a bombardment of Jackson that would not only crush his army, but destroy the city. So that's when he left. And he did so expertly, by the way. Johnston left, made great plans for retreating, which he was good at, as I said earlier. So much so that even though some of the privates in the Union Army had alerted their superior officers to say, hey, something's going on, it really wasn't until the next morning when a slave alerted the Union Army, got on top of one of the parapets and said, hey, you can come on in. They're gone.
So Sherman moves into the city and then doesn't really pursue Johnston, though. And
he makes a half-hearted effort. I think there are two reasons for this. One is obvious. It's hot and it's dry, and his soldiers have been not only fighting in this little campaign for a week, but they've been occupied in the siege of Vicksburg for 47 days before that. But he does send Frederick Steele with part of the 15th Corps across the Pearl River to the little town of Brandon. And there's a brief engagement there, not much, but Steele torches Brandon and tears up more of the railroad and then marches back. I think the other reason is that was not part of Sherman's mission. What Grant was doing was, Grant couldn't take Vicksburg, and he couldn't, and then leave a large occupation force there from then on. He needed the troops in other theaters of operation. He couldn't allow Johnston to just march right back across and take Vicksburg again. That wasn't going to work. So Sherman accomplished what he wanted when Johnston retreated all the way to the eastern edge of the state, virtually left Mississippi. So
Sherman has one last task before he can rejoin Grant, and that is to re-destroy Jackson as a military depot. Now, he'd done this once already back in May, but then he has to do it again. So, did he not do a good job the first time? Why is he doing this?
There's a lot of misunderstanding about what happened in May. There was significant damage. There's no question in May. He left one of my favorite Union generals in charge of the destruction, and he did a pretty good job. That's Joseph Maurer. But their purpose in May was to destroy machine shops and other industrial facilities that had something to do with the military. Now, there were things that got out of hand. Certainly in May, there was the Catholic Church was burned. A hotel or two was burned, and some residential areas. But it wasn't the total destruction that we see in July, and the railroad destruction wasn't nearly as significant because they simply didn't have time. Remember, they were only in Jackson to eliminate the immediate threat of Johnston, which they only learned about because of the action at Raymond. And so they had greater business to take care of than to rip the railroads up. Grant's army was already astride the railroad when he advanced toward Champion Hill. So he had accomplished what he wanted to do. That was cut the railroad to Pemberton, so he couldn't get any supplies, troops that way. So what they were doing in July that they hadn't been able to completely do in May is to destroy the railroad from now on. And Sherman did that under specific orders from Grant. It was not only in Jackson, he also sent smaller expeditions north toward Canton, which had some fairly significant rail shops there, and all the way down the New Orleans, Jackson and Great Northern Railroad down to Brookhaven, Mississippi, and destroying depots, water tanks, all of that, all the way down the line. There's an interesting little side story about the expedition to Canton. Most people would not know this little town in Mississippi. It only recently became its own city, like in the last few years. But there was a depot called Calhoun Station between Jackson and Canton, about halfway. And Sherman assigned an infantry brigade under Charles Woods to accompany his cavalry. Sherman didn't trust his cavalry. He didn't trust any cavalry. He didn't think they could fight. So he's assigned this infantry brigade. It happened to be composed of largely German troops. And so it was known as the German Light Brigade. Well, Woods Brigade marched up the railroad line. They burned Calhoun Station. These German soldiers, many of whom couldn't speak English. And then it just sort of disappeared until the area, the depot, the place, until the turn of the 20th century, when German immigrants from Indiana mostly came down here with the promise to buy cheap agricultural land, and they reestablished a community there, and they named it Gluckstadt. So Gluckstadt, Mississippi, was both destroyed and reborn by German immigrants from the north.
Wow, that's a cool story. So we're talking with Jim Woodrick about his book, The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi, from July of 1863. And Jim, you decided to write this book, as I recall, because Warren Grabow had come to you and said, I've written a book once upon a time. I think I want to revisit this. Tell me that story, because I think that's a really
Warren Grabow was a great friend of mine. He was a crusty soul, but he knew a lot about the Vicksburg campaign, and he was so enthusiastic about everything, even in his 80s, when he unfortunately left us. He passed away. He was in the process of writing a history of the Mississippi River, if you can imagine. He was an engineer, longtime hydrological engineer at the Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg. Warren was a Michigander, and he never lost that little oomph when he was down here, but we were great friends. And Warren and Ed Bars, the inimitable Ed Bars, had written in 1981 a little red book published by the Jackson Civil War Roundtable on the Battle and Siege of Jackson. It was a short volume. It mostly helped organize the official records, which is wonderful. It's great. We didn't have many personal accounts in it at all. And Warren asked me, much to my surprise, if I would be willing to work with him to republish it and add some personal accounts and beef it up with some new sources. So I said I would, and then he had the audacity to die on me and left. I thought, well, that idea is down the drain. That will never happen. It took a while for me to finally pick up the idea. And when I did, I decided to focus on the siege of Jackson instead of the battle, because the battle has been covered in various ways as a part of the Vicksburg campaign study, but no one had ever written a book on the siege of Jackson. There was a particular moment, Chris, where I really felt like, and I'm sure you've had these moments, where somebody from the great beyond was tapping me on the shoulder and say, hey, you need to do this. I worked at the time for the Department of Archives and History, and my office looked out onto the old Capitol. And I was reading a Civil War letter. And yes, I could do that as part of my job. I was reading a Civil War letter one day from a soldier. I believe he was from Massachusetts, if I remember correctly. And he was writing his wife about how he would love to go inside the State House, but they had guards posted and he couldn't get in. And I realized that he was sitting on the door stoop of the state capitol that was facing my office window. And I thought, okay, somebody needs to tell his story and the story of all the other 70,000 men who were here. And so that's what really prompted me to make the call that in some ways I regret making. I had never written anything like this, didn't know how to, hadn't even started. So I had a friend who had done a book with the History Press. And so I just took a gamble, picked up the phone and called them, and they, you know, maybe 2 or 3 days later, they called back and said, "Hey, we like it. It's a great idea. When can you have it done?" And that's when I said, "Oh crap, now what?" So, but eventually it came to fruition. So,
and I'm so glad it did. It's a great book.
Thank you.
Tremendously. And it's such a, I think, a fascinating coda to the Vicksburg campaign on the whole, and so, and as you said, lots of echoes of things that we're going to see in 1860.
Yeah.
And so really worth exploring. The book, The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi, from the History Press. So Jim, before we wrap up, anything you want to add about the project or any insights you want to pass on to our listeners?
Well, I'll throw out a what if.
Okay.
Don't we all hate what ifs, but this is a good one.
We actually have a what if book coming up here.
All right, good.
So this is right.
Maybe
Perfect.
you can add this one. What if Sherman, who had already failed at Chickasaw Bayou, had failed miserably at Jackson?
Mm-hmm.
Would he have ever been able to get over that hump? I don't know that he would have. And if that's the case, who would have led the army in the Atlanta campaign?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe Logan, maybe McPherson. We don't know. Probably wouldn't be Logan because he wasn't
he wasn't part of the club.
He wasn't part of the club. That's right. But anyway, I think that's fascinating.
Wow, that's a great question. Great question to ponder. So, Jim, I've had a great time chatting with you. I can't wait to come hang out.
Same here.
Wow, this is going to be a great time. Thank you so much. So I'm Chris Mikowski for Emerging Civil War. Thank you, everybody. On behalf of Jim, thanks for joining us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.